All right, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and I've been going over the PowerPoint presentations for our AWD1111 class, ASP.NET and web databases, and we are going over the PowerPoint presentations from Murox ASP.NET 4.6 with C# 2015 6th edition. Now we're starting to get into section 2 of the book, and these sections, as mentioned on page 201, are meant to expand upon what we learned in section 1. In chapter 6, we talk all about the server controls. Chapter 7 is kind of an explosion, so to speak, of the validation controls. Chapter 8, we talk about how to manage state of an application or of a form. Chapter 9 goes over master pages. Chapter 10 is more Bootstrap. And Chapter 11 is on how we can get friendly URLs. So, taking it from the top, again, in section 1, we learn the basic skills of working with some of the common server controls, things like labels, text boxes, buttons, and drop-down lists. But now we'll talk about more of the server-side controls. So our objectives, our applied objectives here, you can see there are 2 of them. Design and code a form based on specifications given. Be able to set the focus, the default button, the tab order, and access keys for a form. Our knowledge objectives. Explain when HTML elements should be used instead of server controls. Describe the difference between the way checkbox controls and radio button controls work. Describe the use of an image hyperlink or file upload control. Describe similarities and differences between buttons, link buttons, and image buttons. Describe the use of the command event and the command name property of a button control. Describe the differences between drop-down lists, list boxes, checkbox lists, box lists, radio button lists, and bulleted lists. Explain how the items in any of the list controls are stored and how you refer to said items in code. And finally, describe the use of the list item collection editor. So some of the common controls that you would use most often are shown right here. Now it's kind of interesting because here's the name of the control. So these are server controls. These are their equivalent as HTML or client-side controls. Now we're going to skip this prefix. You can do this whatever way you want. Microsoft has gone back and forth on this over time, but it used to be if I created a label, let's say from the last chapter, we had a label for future value. You would call it like LBL future value. Then it went to the word label again, label future value. Then it went kind of back to LBL, and now it's sort of in a state of flux. I tend to have the name of the control followed by whatever it is, the control is trying to describe. But again, everyone's different in how they do this. Okay, so you can see here, it says here that these are common server controls, so this is not by any means an exhaustive list. Some more. When should you use HTML elements instead of server controls? Well, let's take a look at this. Not sure if this is going to work. I haven't had a chance to go and really take a look at much of anything that I was working with here. So let's see. All right, if we take a look at what we have, this is not a great example. I want to go back to the future value example, so I think I'm going to do that. No. Let's go back to our Chapter 3 Bootstrap future value one that we were working on earlier. All right, you may or may not remember this, but this is what we were working on, okay? All right, now, as we take a look at what's in here, you'll notice that this right here is a label, this is a label, this is a label, and so is this. And when you think about it, yeah, the size of the label may change. It may change from being horizontal to vertical in nature, but monthly investment, annual interest rate, number of years, and future value, those labels never change. So there really and truly is no reason to take those labels that are right there and make them server controls. All right? And as you can see, they're not. If we take a look at these labels that are right here, you'll notice that it just says label, class equal, etc., for equals, etc., but what's missing from there? It's not ASP colon label. It's label. There is no run at equals server. There is no ID there. So the bottom line is, again, when do you use this? Well, you very well could use, should use HTML controls instead of server controls when the contents of those controls aren't going to change. All right. Now, when you know that they are going to change, then of course you would want to make them server controls. Okay, and I guess you could even make the case that if you weren't sure, that probably you would use server controls. Some common control events. Again, as we go through this, hopefully it'll make some sense to you. The on-click event. You literally, they have there that you typically would use on-click with a button or an image button or a link button or an image map, and that's true. You could use an on-click event with literally any control. If you wanted to do something special when you clicked on a text box, you could put some code in the on-click event. You typically would not, but you could. So on-click is typically used for some variation of a button. Command we'll look at in just a couple minutes. Text changed. If I've got a text box and that text box asks me to input my first name, and I put my entire first name in there, Jeffrey, 7 text changed events take place for every single time that, every letter I put in on my name. All right. Check boxes and radio buttons, every time you change what you're choosing, when you add a new item to a checkbox or you change what is, active in the radio button, etc., an on-check change event takes place. Similarly, for a drop-down list, a list box, a radio button list, or a checkbox list, they have the on-selected index changed event that takes place. Now, you may or may not have noticed this, but we have used this before. Might confuse you. Might say, no, we haven't. Well, let's take a look. Where we've got our buttons down here, on click equal BTN clear click, on click equal BTN calculate click. What does that mean? Well, in English, this means that for the calculate button, when you click it, run the click routine of BTN calculate. And what is that? Well, if we go back and we look at in design mode, that says that when we click this button, we want that routine to run. Don't worry that there's not any code in it. That's not what's important. What we're saying is that's the code that should run. And when we click that button, that's the code that should run. All right, remember this example was just meant to illustrate some bootstrap stuff. It was not meant to go through the code and whatever. In fact, I don't even remember. It's been a while since I've got some errors. Doggone it. All right. So again, by default, when you have a button and you run a program, if there's no code associated with a button, the button still does look like it's been pushed in. But nothing will happen when you click a button unless you put some code in that button's click event. What happens when you do that? Whatever you want to have happen. Here's a load event that changes the data in server controls. Remember, the load event is basically it's called when the form gets loaded into memory. But you can literally set it up so that you have different code run when virtually anything happens. This is a method, it says, that gets data from controls and puts them into customer objects, into a customer object. What does that mean? That means that I would create some kind of an object called customer, all right? And it would have an email address, a first name, a state, and some kind of contact info. Then this information over here would be coming from some kind of form. And here I'm copying the fields from the form fields into the object, possibly to stick it into a database. And then we're creating a session object where we're putting all that information in when we get done. All right. So, it says here the form properties for setting the focus of buttons. Okay? Well, default focus and default button. If we take a look at this, so if we go back to here, and we go back and we look at this in design mode, all right, and we click on here. In fact, I think we'd have to click on some blank space somewhere on our form. You may remember this from C# days. But when we do what we're used to doing back in the days of C# is setting the properties over here. And I believe that what we're going to end up doing now is we're going to end up setting these things in code. Okay? So the form properties for setting the focus and the default button. It should be possible for us to come into here and click on that. And there should be some kind of if I come over to here, okay, it doesn't show too much stuff. But there is a way, I don't remember it offhand, but there is a way that we can come in and set the default focus. And what would the default focus do? Well, that would say that when the program begins running, we want the cursor to be in that field. All right, and the default button, what does that do? That says that when we hit the enter key, that's the button's click event that we want to run by default. Associated control ID, tab access, and access key. Well, a couple things about this. First of all, when we talk about, let's just not exactly take them in order, all right? But these are all event handlers. So we can have whatever we want to have happen when a certain event takes place. Okay? This thing right here, this associated control ID, that's like using the 4 equals. Okay? And we looked at the 4 equals, you may or may not remember that, but we looked at that in here. But the 4 equals, when we use that, right there, we were using that on an HTML control, not on a server-side control. So I believe that if we're going to use the 4 equals to associate something on a server-side control, we use associated control ID. Tab index and access keys, those are niceties. There are many people who have been using computers longer than I have, or that are more experienced as far as they've been working for years out in the field where they're used to working their way around a form by hitting the tab key and tabbing from field to field. Well, you can set a tab index. We did a lot of this last semester in the C# class, but you can set a tab index on an ASPX form as well. The access key, that's another way of setting up a hotkey. All right, so for instance, you've seen this kind of thing before. What do you do? A file? Well, I guess it's not done like that, anymore. But if I'm in here, will that work? I don't know. If I do a file, and I want to exit, I can click here. I can do an Alt F4, etc. This is an access key, sometimes referred to as a hotkey. It used to be for any Microsoft product, when you wanted to end, you'd do an Alt X, as an example. Okay? All right, on the next slide here, they're showing you some examples of how you can use this stuff in a form. So notice what we're doing. We're setting the default focus. So what that should say is when we end up running the routine, make sure that this field right there is the one that's highlighted, or where the cursor is resting when the form comes up. When we hit the enter key, this is the submit event for this button, the submit button. That's the one that should fire. Here are some access keys. So if I want to be able to go to name here, I can do, probably is going to end up being an Alt-N or a Control-N. And the same thing, M for email. All right. Notice in here, we've got tab index equal -1. I think that means that that's when nothing else is going to show. All right. So we mentioned taking a look at these one at a time. Labels, again, quite often when you use labels, it's a good idea to get into the mindset of, if you've got labels that are never going to be changing, then probably what you want to end up doing is, instead of using server-side control labels, all right, use HTML labels. But if you use server-side labels, you use the associated control ID, whereas you use the 4 equals when you're using browser-side controls. Sometimes they say this property is required, like when working with checkboxes and radio buttons. The text property is what you put into the label. Text boxes are a little bit unique in that they can either hold inputted information or they can be used to output information. All right? The properties, and these are all taken from page 211. The text mode shows the type of text box that you're using. The default is a single line. You can set multi-line, where you can have more than one line of text, and you can also set password for a password. Text property is what you want to put into the text box. Max length is the number of characters you can enter into a text box. Sometimes people get confused with max length. They think max length is going to be how big the text box is. It has nothing to do with that. That, I believe, is the length property. Max length is how many characters. So if I set up a social security number field, and in that social security number field you must put in the dashes, I would make max length 11. Number, 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 dash, number, number, dash, number, 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 number. Okay? Wrap says whether or not the text automatically wraps when it reaches the end of the line. That's for a multi-line text box. The default on that is true. Read only is what I sometimes use. Rather than a label, I might take a text box and make it read only. Columns and rows are the equivalent of what you'd want to use if you'd kind of be using something as though it's a text area. Now, with HTML5, there's some special text mode values you can use. We've talked about these before in several of the classes. If you set it up to be email, then it'll check to make sure that what you've entered is a valid email address. It'll check to make sure that what you've entered is a valid URL. Phone is one of those that only has limited support. All right? It says that you're using a phone number format. Number, typically with number, if you remember that from the days of HTML, you typically set a minimum and a maximum. All right, you can do that with range. Dates, quite often dates will bring up a date picker, or a date time will bring up a date time picker. Search for a search box, color to bring up the color palette. So they've got the ASPX here for a label and a multi-line text box. So what that says in English is that the label is an HTML control. The text box allows multiple line format with a maximum of 5 rows of input. Here, we're using a text box and we're saying its type is email. All right, again, to try to specify that indeed what should go in there is an email address. Let me check my time here. All right, I'm at 22 minutes. This particular set of lectures may very well take 3 lectures to complete. I have no problem with that. So I'll pick it up in just a couple minutes.